thinking, God, this place is full of mafia guys, and they're all trying to kill me. So we were going out on stage to go play. And the only thing I could think of to do was, I'm going to play for my life. And they let me live. Ever since then, I thought, that works.
Jerry Garcia, a name forever tied to a generation both enchanted and rebellious. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. Jerry was a man with a guitar and a soul that refused to be tamed. He was the unofficial leader of the Grateful Dead, the band that shaped an entire cultural movement. From decades-long tours to the devoted Deadheads community that still exists today. With a sound blending psychedelic rock, bluegrass, blues, and folk, Jerry didn't just play music, he opened a whole new world. The Grateful Dead were known for marathon concerts that lasted over 5 hours, played without a set list, and defied all norms, just like Jerry's life itself. But when the stage lights dimmed, he returned to a very different reality. Heroin addiction, broken families, drug-induced comas, and an increasing sense of isolation. Jerry once admitted, "I can't go outside. People recognize me." His life was a constant dance between artistic inspiration and self-destruction, between an immortal legacy and wounds that never truly healed. He was an artist who painted with sound, but who also dragged himself down with the weight of the very spotlight he helped create. What turned a boy who lost his father at age 5 into an irreplaceable icon of an entire generation? And behind the legendary music, was there a loneliness no one dared to face? Join us as we uncover the untold story of Jerry Garcia, the man who lived, loved, created, and paid the price. Early life. Jerome John Garcia was born on August 1st, 1942, in San Francisco, at a time when America was still shrouded in the lingering aftermath of World War II. He was the second son of Jose Ramon Joe Garcia, a Spanish-born clarinet and saxophone player, and Ruth Marie, a Swedish-American nurse. Jerry came into a culturally mixed family where music, manual labor, and a certain stoic silence coexisted. His father, Joe Garcia, had once been a band leader for local dance orchestras. But after a dispute with the musicians' union, he left music behind and turned to running a bar. Jerry's mother, Ruth, quit nursing after marriage to help manage the business. But their small family didn't hold on to peace for long. When Jerry was 4, he suffered a serious accident while chopping wood with his older brother. He lost the middle finger on his right hand to the blade of an axe. That injury left him with a lifelong deformity, and it became the first sign that Jerry would never follow a normal path. But the real tragedy struck a year later. At age 5, Jerry went fishing with his father, a seemingly ordinary morning that turned into a nightmare when Joe slipped and drowned in front of his young son. Jerry stood there, helpless, unable to do anything. His father's death wasn't just his first trauma. It left a spiritual void that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A void he would try to fill with music, substances, and endless touring. His mother continued running the bar, but had little time to care for her 2 sons. Jerry was sent to live with his grandparents in the suburbs of Santa Cruz for 5 years, a childhood marked by the absence of a father, the distance from his mother, and long, quiet silences. In 1953, when his mother remarried, Jerry was brought back to live with her new family, but the sense of disconnection never left. In the years that followed, Jerry grew up moving constantly, changing homes, schools, and never forming close friendships or bonds with anything except art. The once shy boy began showing clear talent in drawing and music. When he was 15, his mother gave him a guitar, a gift that would change everything. Jerry became obsessed, teaching himself to play, practicing for hours each day, and immersing himself in records. But school was always a struggle. He was expelled from several schools, had to repeat 8th grade, and eventually dropped out of high school at 17. With no direction, no real future, and no mentor to guide him, Jerry enlisted in the Army, hoping to start over. But less than a year later, he was discharged for repeated disciplinary violations. Drifting, wounded, and carrying unspoken scars, Jerry Garcia at 18 had nothing but a guitar, a few blurred memories, and a deep, unrelenting need to escape reality. No one could have guessed that the young man, who had lost a father to the current, a finger to an accident, and his place in society to his own defiance, would one day become a defining force of an entire generation. But perhaps it was precisely because he didn't belong to this world that Jerry had to create another through music. Early career. After being discharged from the Army in 1960, Jerry Garcia returned to the only thing that ever made him feel like he truly belonged: music. He had no money, no clear goals, but in Palo Alto, epicenter of free-spirited creativity near Stanford University, he found something even more valuable: a community. Garcia drifted through cafes, bookstores, and art spaces where outcasts and dreamers were quietly creating on their own terms. It was here that he met Robert Hunter, a young poet with a free mind and a remarkably keen ear. They started playing music together, a duo nobody paid much attention to, but one that would later write dozens of timeless songs for the Grateful Dead. The early 1960s marked a revival of folk and bluegrass. Garcia immersed himself in these genres, learning to play the banjo and mandolin and diving deep into traditional American music. He played in small bands like the Sleepy Hollow Hog Stompers, the Wildwood Boys, and the Hart Valley Drifters, strange names for temporary groups. But they were places where Jerry honed his skills and experimented without boundaries. In 1963, Garcia met Sarah Ruppenthal, a Stanford student and a kindred acoustic partner. They married quickly and formed Jerry and Sarah, performing at small parties and classrooms. It was perhaps the only period in Jerry's life that could be described as stable. He taught music at Dana Morgan Music Store, cared for his daughter Heather, and temporarily stepped away from life on the road. But Garcia was never one to stay still. In 1964, he returned to performing, this time with a jug band called Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions. Among its members were teenage guitarist Bob Weir and Ron Pigpen McKernan, who brought a raw blues energy to the group. As the Beatles and the electric wave of rock and roll swept through America, Garcia and his bandmates sensed a new wind rising. They put down their folk instruments and picked up electric guitars, drums, and keyboards. The Jug Band evolved into a rock band. From Mother McCree's to the Warlocks, and by late 1965, they had a new name, the Grateful Dead. The name, according to legend, was discovered by Garcia when he randomly opened a dictionary. Grateful Dead, spirits released from suffering through a good deed by the living. Spiritual, strange, anti-establishment. It was the perfect name for a band that defied every convention. From the beginning, the Grateful Dead never followed formulas. They didn't rehearse like other bands, and their shows weren't polished performances. They were explorations. And Jerry Garcia, with dreamy eyes and an unruly beard, was the guide for every journey. In 1966, they released their first single, featuring two electrified folk songs, Stealin' and Don't Ease Me In. Around the same time, Garcia helped Jefferson Airplane record Surrealistic Pillow, suggesting the album's title and playing guitar on several tracks, but due to contract constraints, he wasn't credited officially. Instead, he was listed as the Spiritual and Musical Advisor, a strange title, but one that suited him perfectly. That's how Jerry Garcia's career began, from Palo Alto coffee houses to nameless garage bands, and then suddenly to becoming a symbol of countercultural music. No formal training, no marketing strategy, no crafted image, just a man with a guitar searching for a sound honest enough to fill the emptiness inside him, and somehow an entire generation followed. Career success. When the Grateful Dead officially formed in late 1965, Jerry Garcia was 23 years old. He wasn't the most handsome in the group, nor the strongest vocalist, but he was the soul. Every piece of music that began in Garcia's hands wasn't just a sequence of chords, It was a wave, free, unmeasured, unrestrained, and completely authentic. In their early years, the Grateful Dead played like they were fleeing from every musical convention, a chaotic style full of haunting noise, LSD, and deep immersion. But by 1970, exhausted from constant touring and financial troubles, the band returned to more stripped-down, rootsy music. And it was then that Garcia entered his creative peak. The album Working Man's Dead, 1970, was a turning point. Simple, folk rock, deeply human. Garcia and Robert Hunter wrote Uncle John's Band, a gentle anthem about friendship, forgiveness, and the desire for community. Songs like High Time and Casey Jones showed that Garcia wasn't just writing about psychedelic visions. He was confronting their consequences, too. Just months later came American Beauty, and Garcia's music soared. Ripple was a prayer set to melody. Friend of the Devil, a song about outrunning one's conscience, was later covered by artists like Counting Crows, Lyle Lovett, and Ramblin' Jack Elliott. With this album, the Grateful Dead proved they didn't need radio hits to become legends. They only needed a genuine soul. The Grateful Dead toured almost constantly. They had no fixed set lists. Each concert was a unique universe, created in the moment, based on mood, atmosphere, and the mental state of each member, especially Garcia. He could sit silently in the shadows for nearly an hour, then suddenly erupt with a 15-minute solo. The audience, thousands strong, needed no introductions, no hit songs. They came to witness Jerry pulling raw emotion out of each string. Because of this, Grateful Dead shows often lasted 3 to 5 hours, and countless unofficial recordings became sacred texts among Deadheads. In 1972, the band released Europe's 72, a live triple album featuring new songs like Brown-Eyed Women, He's Gone, and Tennessee Jed, each stamped with Garcia's creative fingerprint. Not wanting to be confined to the Grateful Dead, Garcia formed the Jerry Garcia Band, a space for him to play on his own terms. Here he sang soul, reggae, funk, and covered Dylan and Chuck Berry. While the Dead was a collective journey, the JGB was Garcia's gentle monologue. He also collaborated with keyboardist Merle Saunders, creating spontaneous jam sessions unlike anything being recorded at the time. Albums like Live at Keystone and Heavy Turbulence became prized gems for lovers of offbeat, genre-defying music. Garcia also played with New Riders of the Purple Sage, a band steeped in cowboy country rock. On their 1971 debut album, he played the pedal steel guitar, a notoriously difficult and expressive instrument, and he mastered it, just like everything else he touched. But the price of brilliance was physical and mental exhaustion. By the mid-1970s, Garcia was deeply addicted to heroin. Grateful Dead members had to adjust tour schedules, shorten shows, fearing he wouldn't make it through. At times, Jerry appeared on stage as a shadow, silent, repeating the same notes, or walking off mid-performance. Yet fans stayed, believing the genius was still there, just asleep. In 1986, he fell into a diabetic and drug-induced coma, spending weeks in the hospital, barely surviving. It was a wake-up call, but also a reminder that Garcia had become something larger than a man. When he awoke, no one asked, "Do you still want to continue?" Instead, they said, "You have to. We need you." In the early 1990s, Garcia withdrew from the relentless touring. He returned to acoustic music and bluegrass, the roots he'd first embraced as a teen. Albums like Garcia, Grisman, and Not for Kids Only, recorded with mandolinist David Grisman, were quiet, introspective works, no longer chasing hallucinations, but offering the music of a man who had walked through a desert and was finally resting beneath a tree. Jerry Garcia never had a top 10 hit, but he gave more than 2,000 performances, wrote hundreds of songs that live on in listeners' memories, and built a community of millions who still call his name, not as a pop idol, but as a guide. He succeeded not because he conquered the market, but because he never entered it in the first place. Solo career. In 1972, while the Grateful Dead were at the peak of their fame, Jerry Garcia quietly released his debut solo album, simply titled Garcia. There was no major promotion, no polished imagery, yet the album held some of the most unfiltered, essential parts of him. Garcia played nearly all the instruments himself: guitar, bass, keyboard, pedal steel, leaving only the drums to his longtime bandmate Bill Kreutzmann. Songs like Sugaree, Deal, and Loser would later become staples not only in Grateful Dead shows, but also in Jerry Garcia band performances. This wasn't an outward-facing record. It was an introspective monologue set to music, where Garcia had no one to answer to, nothing to represent, only his own state of mind expressed through sound. 2 years later, he released Compliments, a collection of cover songs that, while seemingly simple, mapped out Garcia's inner landscape. From Bob Dylan to Chuck Berry, Smokey Robinson to vintage soul and blues standards, the album wasn't about showing off skill, it was about showing heart. Each song was chosen not to impress, but to recall what had nourished his spirit before he ever picked up a guitar. The album's title came from a sticker on the original pressing's Compliments of Garcia, as if he were offering listeners a quiet gift with no grand gesture. In 1976, after years of touring and sinking deeper into addiction, Garcia released Reflections, a somber, nostalgic work. In songs like They Love Each Other and Comes a Time, the charismatic frontman of the Dead seemed to fade, replaced by a tired man searching for meaning in broken relationships, missed moments, and reunions that never happened. The album was a mix of the Jerry Garcia Band and members of the Dead, almost as if Garcia himself wasn't sure where he belonged, only that he had to keep writing music to stay balanced amid the fracture. By 1978, he released Cats Under the Stars, a project Garcia personally called his favorite album. It was one of the rare times he poured his full energy, pride, and hope into a solo work. But life doesn't always reward artists who are too honest. The album flopped commercially, nearly forgotten upon release. Yet for those patient enough to listen, it remains a hidden gem, where Garcia no longer played out of obligation or ideology, but from pure love of sound and the gentleness of spirit. Cats Under the Stars wasn't a declaration, it was a whisper in the night. Beyond studio albums, Garcia built an entirely separate performance universe with the Jerry Garcia Band. Unlike the Grateful Dead, where every show was a sprawling jam under the weight of community expectations, JGB gave him space to slow down, to sing beloved songs, to blend soul with reggae, to bring gospel to the stage, and to breathe without fear of letting anyone down. In JGB, he wasn't leading, he was part of the flow, not to guide, but to accompany. Then there were his artistic friendships, loose, pressure-free collaborations. With Merle Saunders, Garcia created jazz and funk-infused jams in small clubs. With David Grisman, his old bluegrass buddy, he returned to acoustic purity in albums like Garcia, Grisman, and Not for Kids Only. These recordings weren't made for the masses. They were made for those who knew how to listen, as if Garcia was playing for a few old friends in an attic, with mandolins, a gravelly voice, and stories with no clear beginning or end. Jerry Garcia's solo career wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't a way to escape the Grateful Dead or chase some new kind of fame. It was the quiet space he needed in a life that was otherwise deafening. There, he could play like a child again, not afraid of mistakes, not aiming to be right, unburdened by the weight of being a symbol, just a man searching for peace in each chord. And it's in those quiet, unassuming moments that Jerry Garcia left behind his most honest music. Not to be famous, but simply to live. Personal life. If Jerry Garcia's musical career was a symphony of freedom, then his personal life was a series of broken riffs, sometimes tender, often tangled, and rarely ending with any true resolution. For Jerry, love never followed a set order. It arrived suddenly, left quietly, and always left behind knots no one could untangle, not even him. Garcia married for the first time in 1963 to Sarah Ruppenthal, a Stanford student and his first acoustic partner during the folk music days in Palo Alto. They had a daughter named Heather, who would later become a classical violinist. But the marriage dissolved quickly, not due to dramatic conflict, but because Jerry was always on the move, always turning in a new direction, always chasing something just out of reach from domestic life. Sarah once said, "I couldn't hold on to someone who didn't belong to the ground." Next came a relationship that lasted over a decade with Carolyn Adams, nicknamed Mountain Girl, a counterculture icon and former housemate of Ken Kesey. Though they never had a traditional wedding, they had two daughters together, Annabelle, born 1970, and Teresa, born 1974. Mountain Girl understood Jerry more deeply than anyone. She stood by him through the explosion of Grateful Dead's fame, his spirals into heroin addiction, the exhausting tours, and the many times he disappeared into music and shut the world out. And yet, even with her, Jerry couldn't stay. In the early 1980s, he descended deeper into addiction and began a relationship with Deborah Coons, a young filmmaker. The relationship caused serious tension within his family. Mountain Girl and the children felt abandoned, and the Deadhead community became divided, many unwilling to accept this new woman beside their icon. But Jerry, as always, offered no explanations, no apologies. He simply followed his feelings, and his feelings never kept their promises. After years of going back and forth between the two women, Garcia finally married Deborah Coons legally in 1994, just 1 year before his death. That short-lived marriage triggered a long, bitter series of legal battles between the official widow and his former partners, between his children and his estate managers. A tangle of lawsuits almost unheard of in rock history, unless your name was Jerry Garcia. But the most heartbreaking part wasn't the lawsuits. It was what his daughter, Trixie Garcia, revealed after 30 years of silence. At his funeral, she stood up and said bluntly, "My father was a bad dad." The remark was shocking at the time, but in later interviews, Trixie clarified. She wasn't condemning him, but stating a painful truth, wrapped in love. That Jerry, inspirational to millions, couldn't be there when his daughter needed him. That there were phone calls between father and daughter cut short because he fell asleep mid-conversation from heroin. That there were times he gave her money, sent her off to pick up supplies, then retreated back into his private room, one no one was allowed to enter except Trixie. She called him her best friend, someone she loved deeply, but also the person who hurt her the most, and for that reason she chose not to follow his path. She and her sisters rejected drugs, rejected the stage, and rejected the kind of slow death masked as an artist's life. They chose authenticity. They chose sustainable business. They chose to build their father's legacy not as worship, but as awareness. Jerry Garcia was never a model father, never an ideal husband, and never tried to be anything other than himself. His life was a string of unfinished relationships, passionate but abruptly ended, deeply connected yet rarely present. He didn't build a proper family, but he built a community. He didn't keep a home together, but he kept the spirit of a generation intact. That was the tragedy and the truth of a man who lived only through music, but whose music left him no room to be a father, a husband, or a lover in any traditional sense. To Jerry, personal life was never life after the stage. It was an extension of it, a space where he played, while quietly missing the most important parts. Final years and legacy. By the time he entered the 1990s, Jerry Garcia was no longer the youthful artist with a guitar slung over his shoulder, dreamy eyes, and hundreds of shows ahead of him. He was a man burdened by decades of accumulated weight, diabetes, the aftermath of heroin and cocaine use, exhaustion from thousands of tours, and personal relationships that had long fallen apart. And yet, strangely, he kept going. Not for fame, not out of duty to the Grateful Dead, but because music was the only thing he had left. After falling into a coma in 1986, Garcia woke as if he had been drained of life. Doctors said he had crossed the line between life and death, and those close to him knew he was no longer the same. His health was clearly declining. His body grew heavier, his skin pale, his breathing labored. Still, he returned to the stage, quieter now, slower, but clinging to the last remnants of what used to be brilliance. In his final decade, Garcia avoided long tours and turned back to acoustic and bluegrass, the sounds he had first fallen in love with as a teenager before losing his father. Albums like Garcia, Grisman, and Not for Kids Only were soft, humble works, no longer filled with psychedelic dreamscapes, but with the quiet reflections of someone who had lived through every extreme and now longed for peace. But even that peace was fragile. Despite multiple attempts at rehab, Garcia remained susceptible to relapse. By then, his body could no longer handle the toll. Every performance became an extraordinary effort, not to impress, but to prove he could still be Jerry Garcia, if only for a fleeting moment. By 1995, his health had rapidly deteriorated. On August 8th, he checked into the Serenity Knolls rehab facility in Forest Knolls, California, quietly, without media attention. But the next morning, August 9th, 1995, Jerry Garcia died in his sleep from a heart attack. He passed away without stage lights, without a guitar, without a crowd. Just him, and the final end to a journey that had never truly rested. His death sent a shockwave across the nation, not just among fans, but throughout America. A part of counterculture, a generation, a symbol of freedom, was gone. Thousands gathered in cities across the country, San Francisco, New York, Boulder, not to mourn a celebrity, but to mourn a piece of their own youth. Sleepless nights, healing songs, shared tears and music that needed no comforting words. But Jerry Garcia didn't just leave behind a band, a few solo albums, or the paintings exhibited after his death. What he left was a way of life, a spirit, a community that endured beyond him. The Grateful Dead became Dead and Company, with former members still performing to keep the flame alive. Bootleg recordings of his shows, even on fuzzy cassette tapes, were traded like sacred texts among deadheads. Generations born after his death still found pieces of themselves in his lyrics, in solos he played under midnight skies. And it was his daughters, especially Trixie Garcia, who turned that legacy into something not just remembered, but lived. Trixie didn't become a musician. Instead, she chose to preserve the Garcia name through deeply personal projects, from curating his artwork exhibitions to launching the Garcia hand-picked cannabis line to producing documentaries about his life and philosophy. No idolizing, no myth-making. She told the truth. Garcia as a genius, fragile, complex, and relentlessly authentic. Jerry Garcia once said he didn't like being seen as a spiritual leader. He just wanted to play music. But his music, whether he intended it or not, guided an entire generation through war, rebellion, freedom, and disillusionment. He didn't write anthems of triumph. He wrote for the lost, the aching, the ones unsure how to begin again. And for that, he still lives, through memories, old speakers, and a community that never faded even after its founder was gone. Jerry Garcia died at 53, but what he created has never aged. Jerry Garcia's story isn't just a chapter in music history. It's a journey full of contradictions, between creativity and self-destruction, between glory and the personal voids that not everyone dares to face. If you believe that Jerry Garcia, with all his unfinished pieces, still deserves to be remembered as one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next stories. When was the first time you heard Ripple or Friend of the Devil? Share it in the comments, because sometimes just one song can bring back an entire lifetime. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.